let's start with Oldboy. This is a film that I think many people will know. Park Chan-wook is obviously a master, and this is the film that brought him international critical acclaim. You have a paper describing it as a global techno-cultural metamorphosis. Tell us about Oldboy, Nilesh.
Yeah. So it was fun writing the paper. It was for Yonsei University, and my professor really liked my take on it, on the technological aspect of the film, how the technology at the time coincided with the film. And then later, I thought, after writing the paper, I thought very few people will read this. So I thought it would be good to turn it into an exhibition. So then I turned it into an exhibition a year later. So starting with Oldboy, first of all, a professor at Yonsei University, her name is Jo Eun-sun. She had written a very interesting paper about it, and talking about allegory and its relationship to Oldboy. So in her paper, she said how during most of Korean cinema from 1919 until the end of the Korean New Wave, which was in the 90s, allegory was a constant theme in Korean cinema. And, allegory is basically often countries that have suffered through war or colonization, poverty, etc. Allegory is said to be a common theme in the cinemas that they produce. And so Korean cinema is no exception in that way. So either explicitly or inexplicitly, there is some kind of commentary in the stories of film based, something is more related to morality or politics. So up until Oldboy, allegory was a very common part of Korean cinema. We'll come on to 80s cinema, 90s cinema later, but it can be very political, anti-government, making commentaries on the negative sides of capitalism, democracy, etc. And so these are quite clear in Korean New Wave films. Whereas with Oldboy, it's quite Jo Eun-sun, the writer, professor, she says it's a very big departure in this way. So you've seen Oldboy
Many
times, yeah. So I don't know if you remember, but there's a scene where he's imprisoned for about 15 years, right, in that room, and the only thing he has for company is the TV.
Yeah.
And so there's a part when he's watching TV, and there are all these images of different kinds of news in there, presidents coming and going, and various Korean news, international news. I think 9/11 is in there.
Forrest Gump-like almost, isn't it? It's like a timeline of events that have...
Exactly. It's a timeline. Yeah, exactly. That's right. Yeah. So we see all this flicker, and it helps us understand, okay, all these years have been going by since he's been trapped in that room. And so normally with allegory, it would go into at least a couple of them to make a political or a moral statement. Whereas with Oldboy, Jo Eun-sun writes that in Oldboy it's not the case. We only see the images. There's no other substance or depth behind that. So it's very postmodern in that way. So in that way, Jo Eun-sun states that it's the end of allegory. It's Korean cinema through Oldboy. It's no longer talking or thinking about itself too much. It's not dwelling on its political, moral situation. It just shows it, and that's it. And this is a very important aspect of Oldboy. And, I remember when I was at university in Manchester, and Oldboy was the first Korean film that I saw. I went to the cinema, and you too as well, yeah. And it was really something, And in modern Korean film history, Oldboy is so important because, like I said, it broke away from allegory, and it really incorporated and accepted a Hollywood cinema as well. So, we do have Korean elements in there, such as the octopus eating, for example. But then there's also a very strong Hollywood aspect in there. So Oldboy is really a prominent film because it's a step between South Korea and the Western world, and the world, actually, since Hollywood has taken over the world, And so that's what helped to make it a big hit as well. And so we need to kind of, Oldboy was made in 2003, released then. And we briefly talked about allegory, but another aspect of Oldboy becoming such a big hit in Korea and also in the world is what came before Oldboy. So, we had the Asian financial crisis from 97 to about 1999. And, unfortunately, a lot of people in Korea suffered financially. But in actual fact, cinema was an industry that was booming. People wanted to, seemingly people wanted to escape and just have entertainment during that period. And so, as you know, the Busan International Film Festival is so well known, so well recognized in the world, especially in Asia. And that was founded in 1996. So just a year before the Asian financial crisis. And then during the Asian financial crisis, a lot of Korean conglomerates, such as CG, they started investing heavily into cinema and film production from around 97 onwards. So I have a statistic here. So, for example, in 1997, there were almost 500 multiplexes. But by 2003, there were just over 1,000. So it really doubled in those few years because of this private investment from these companies going into film production and cinemas as well within South Korea. And another interesting statistic I found on this topic is from 1999 to 2004, the number of Korean films that were exported to Asian countries and the USA. Can you guess what percentage it increased by between 1999 and 2004?
What percentage it increased by?
Yeah, in that
exports
5-year period.
250%.
Good try. 350%. So massive increase, right? In that 4 or 5 year period, a huge increase of exports. So these were things that were happening before Oldboy came. The development, the Korean government was promoting Korean film abroad. Private companies were also doing that as well.
Screen quotas would have been around at the time. Film quotas and screen quotas, there was regulations that Korean cinemas had to show a certain amount of Korean movies.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. We'll come on to that topic later, I think. But, from around 1987, 88, with the Olympics happening in 88, there were a lot of American production companies entering Korea. And that created a lot of competition, which many people were not happy about. But that's a different topic. And so, later quotas came in as a minimum number of Korean films to be screened at the cinemas. And so, Oldboy is really a child of that era, a child of an era where South Korean cinema was no longer just restricted for Koreans in Korea. It's really stepping out of its boundaries, entering other shores, Western and also Asian as well. And the style of filmmaking, like I mentioned, away from allegory, more into Hollywood and a global cinema aspect. So it's a very prominent film. And another aspect, an aspect that I focused on in the paper that I wrote, and an element of it in the exhibition that I curated, was really about the technological aspect. So, the internet became, it was an American invention, but it became public around 94. To be legally accessed by the public around 1994. And then we had the first smartphone around 1999 by BlackBerry. So, this was obviously the world changed so much, and we can imagine Korean society changing so much as well with the online world as well. This also affected the game world. I don't know if you remember that period in the late 90s, early 2000s, but there are certain games companies like Sega and also Nintendo. Oh, and one of them, I think it might have been Nintendo, they created one console that was Wi-Fi connected. So you could play with other players around the world.
Wow.
Yeah, which is, amazing, So the effect of the internet was also affecting the games industry, as well, with the console industry. And so if we look at the editing of Oldboy, in some parts of, actually in quite a few parts of Oldboy, we see that in the editing. Now,
we see what in the editing?
Yeah, so for example, there's a part where this is much later after Dae-soo, the protagonist, has escaped, and he finds the building that he was held captive in. And then he takes the elevator up, and then he starts fighting people. Do you remember that part? Yeah.
Very
It's
memorable.
kind of an
It's a
iconic
long
part.
shot.
Exactly, it's a long shot. Yeah, that's right. So he gets out of the lift, the elevator, and then immediately starts fighting. And there's no cutting. It's just from the camera pans from the lift, panning left, to the right, as he just beats up people. Which is so much like, if you think of Mortal Kombat,
Streets of Rage or something like
Street
this.
Fighter, Streets of Rage, Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat. These are the games that we played, back in, especially I did back in the early 2000s, So that's one example of that game aspect put into the way Oldboy was shot and also edited. The fact that it wasn't edited, it was just a continuous long shot left to right as well as he beat up people, So that's one example. And then if we think about the internet and the internet's influence on Oldboy and its editing style, there are parts when, for example, Desu is with his partner. They're in the car in that SUV, and they're driving, and then it edits from top to bottom, flipping to a different scene. So sometimes a clock appears as well. So there's this kind of a very instant type of editing, but also showing the progression of time. So it's an instant type of editing, but with a clock sometimes as well. So it's basically, there's this speediness of the internet. With the internet, you can be in any time zone. You might be in South Korea right now, but you can be automatically in North America. And with the internet, eras don't exist. We're in the present now, but you can go back to the Victorian period or whatever period, right? And so there's an element also in Oldboy where he starts to try to remember, like, why does this man want vengeance on me? And he goes back to his high school days, and he's kind of entering a dream. And there are all he goes back to his high school, but prior to going back to the high school, what he does is he drives his SUV, parks it in the playground in the front yards of the high school. And then it starts to change into another scene of the past. So the present and the past end up mixing up. So when we see the scene of him in the past, there's the younger Desu, the high school Desu, following the girl. But then the older Desu is also there in the same in the same scenes. So there's a mixture of the old and the new coexisting within the same shots as well. So these are other examples of like the internet and gaming industry having an influence on the way it was edited and shot.
Where time doesn't exist and something from the 1970s exists next to something from the 1990s to the 2000s.
Exactly.
The past has got bigger on the internet.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. So I found this aspect quite fascinating, and how the technological evolutions of the era, especially the internet, the smartphone, the gaming industry, really influenced Oldboy in that way.
It's interesting to hear about Oldboy being a postmodern film, a film that's no longer based in allegory, one that's designed maybe with a Hollywood angle, and it succeeded at that. We sometimes think that the current Hallyu success is new, but this was at Cannes in the early 2000s and has been lauded for a long time. Does it still have an influence today? I mean, because of that successful first step, we see a lot of some Korean content these days with Squid Game and We Are All Dead and zombies and things. Do you think Oldboy has had an influence that lasts today?
I believe so, and the reason is, if we think about K-pop, K-drama, or K-film, one of the reasons that they have become so successful globally and continue to do so is because they have one foot in Korea. There are Korean aspects that we see. Parasite has that stone, which is very a traditional Korean thing, and the half basement homes is also very Korean. But at the same time, there's also something global or Western about these Hallyu creations that people can relate to. around the world. Whether you're from Canada, or Vietnam, India, Korea, there are certain things that people can relate to. So, based on the research I've done at Yonsei, I found that this has been a big key to the success of K-pop and K-drama and K-films in the recent years. To have something which is slightly exotic, the Korean factor, that generally global or non-Korean people would not know about. And then the other 50% will be something global that people can relate to. And if we think about Parasite again, there's the gap between the rich and poor, right? The financial hardships that people have, and these things have been increasing in many countries. So these are things that many people can relate to as well, right?
And if it was completely universal, it wouldn't be Korean and people wouldn't like it. But if it was completely Korean, it might not be as appealing on a broad level. So it balances that. Has Korean content lost anything by being less allegorical? You've talked about the end of allegory in this, I forget the professor's name, Ian Su?
Jo Eun-sun?
Jo Eun-sun, sorry. Has it lost something? It's no longer turning the spotlight onto onto social issues, onto cultural issues and identity issues. Is allegory still important?
That's a good question, because it is, everything is social political, right? And if we look at when allegory was kind of coming to an end in Korean New Wave cinema, which was around the mid to late 90s, the mid to late 90s was also a period when generally people in South Korea were becoming more content with the politics in Korea as well. As you know, Korea experienced such a hard time with politics here, right? And this through the 60s, 70s, 80s, and part of the early 90s. But as the country started to become more stable politically, there was less of a need for people to, for these hardships and tensions to be reflected in film, because it wasn't such an issue anymore, actually. And what was growing in the 90s, from the early mid 90s onwards, was a more westernization coming in, such as Western brands, luxury from the West, for example, and a lot of capitalism. Since the 88 Olympics, since then, Korea just grew more and more and became more global. And the 90s was really the point where it was, becoming larger and larger. And so there are more films which also reflect this aspect as well of, Korea not just being Korea and kind of isolated in a way, but really, like we said earlier, moving away from allegory and opening its doors to other things such as Hollywood or the influence of Hollywood on its film.
Making blockbusters and making media and making content.
Exactly.
It's not always didactic or serving the state or criticizing the state.
Exactly. Yeah. And really showing itself in terms of Korean cinema, showing itself to the world. Films like, Shiri, or JSA, they were huge successes, especially in Asian countries as well, So
blockbusters that focus on North South, and there's still some didactism in there, I think, with those. Nilesh, I'm going to jump back in time a little bit with this question, because you wrote an article titled "Angry Men in Korean New Wave Cinema," which was tracing the emasculation in South Korea through colonization, war, and the rapid modernization, which you've just touched on. And so we'll start with the male characters, 80s and 90s films, these characters of tragic, angry, lost, or however you might describe them. And I think this is very interesting because today there's a lot of talk about alt-right, incels, Korea. This is a topic of conversation that comes up a lot. But going back to the 80s and 90s, how did you see angry men in Korean New Wave cinema?
Have you seen Chilsu and Mansu?
Embarrassingly, no. But I need to now, having done
there are certain films that I can recommend people to. Chilsu and Mansu is probably the most well known. It was made in 1988. And there was another one called Whale Hunting, A Single Spark as well. So something we have to keep in mind is all of these big directors like Park Kwang-soo, Bae Chang-ho, Kwak Ji-kyun, all of these big directors in the 80s and early 90s, they were all men, all Korean males. So we have to keep in mind that, these were films about men, created by men as well. And a lot of these, something we need to remember about the Korean wave is it was born like any wave, or all cinema is. I mean, it's usually related to its social political background, right? And so with Chundu Wan, and in the early 80s, and just with so much what's the word? Just so much hardship from the Chundu Wan government in terms of how many voices were silenced, by the government, intellectual voices, university students not being able to go to university, things like that. So the Korean New Wave was born out of that. It was these directors that wanted to show their political opinions that were mostly against the government. Now, a turning point was like from 1980 to 83. Chundu Wan was very strict in his government. We know about the Gwangju massacre, which happened in 80. And even after that, a lot of students and professors were banned from going to university for periods of time because students were often the activists who were against the government. So a lot of people were silenced. But then Chundu Wan and his government, they realized around 83, what we're doing is not getting any popularity. And also the voting period was coming soon, I think around 84. So they decided to become more lenient and friendly, reopen the universities, got rid of the military and the military buses out of the campuses, and also relaxed the film laws around 1984. So this was a very big turning point because now that the film laws were relaxed, anyone could open a film production company. Because basically, from around there was a point during the Park Chung-hee era where Park Chung-hee's government made a new law saying that they really, no one could easily open a film production company. There were all these censorship and laws to go through. But with this relaxation around 1984, as long as you completed the application forms, and you could legally open it, anyone could almost open a film company, a film production company. And so there was this new generation of these younger Korean directors who were politically minded. They were very anti-government, pro-democracy, and they also wanted to try to elevate the quality of Korean cinema and be recognized as auteurs as well, rather than just film for entertainment or light entertainment purposes, And so maybe I'm going away from the original topic, but your question was about how are these angry men depicted, right? So
I'm also just interested where that fits into the 3S policy, or if you have any thoughts of that. Were they at the same time?
Yeah, right. So the 3S policy, which is sports, sex,
Screen.
and screen, exactly, yeah. And this was during the Chunduan period from the early 80s, which was a way to distract people, by the government investing more money and time into promoting sports, such as stadiums and games, sex through things like room salons or motels, and screen through cinema and TV as well, So these were very strategic government maneuvers to try to distract the population from political thought to more fun entertainment.
Bread and circuses.
Yes, right, exactly. So these were the 3 S's, And so the Korean New Wave, these directors like Park Kwang-soo, they had far more freedom than ever before to convey what they wanted to. And so the films, the men that we have in these films, they're angry. There's generally a loss of the self, and they attempt to try to recuperate their masculinity as well. And often there's some kind of urban alienation. These men are often in cities, but they're alienated in some way. And they often reflect a frustration in not having their voices heard, either from women. It could be on a micro level, with women or people around them, or it could be on the macro level, which is more governmental as well. So there are some reasons, why these men are angry. One is regarding the government the political situation at the time. The second is with the globalization really, becoming bigger and bigger. Some people had difficulty making money during that period through the 80s and the 90s as well. And then there are other smaller aspects in films, such as losing their girlfriends or wives to other men as well. And these are also aspects touched on upon films as well, in films. So, for example, Chilsu and Mansu is a film I strongly recommend to anyone to create kind of. I think this film, Chilsu and Mansu, really encapsulates a lot of things that we've been talking about so far on this topic, of angry men. And the film was made in '88. And it was by Park Kwang-soo. And even though I said censorship went down a lot and film directors had far more freedom to depict what they wanted to, it wasn't 100% freedom. And so an interesting trivia point in this is Park Kwang-soo. He originally got the idea from a Taiwanese play, I think it was, a very political play. And then he wanted to adapt it into a film for the Korean audiences. So it had its base in a very political foundation from Taiwan, very anti-government. And so on the day that the Olympics were opening, he went to the film board then to get the signature of approval because they were so busy with other things, so he planned it on purpose.
Smart.
Yeah, very smart, exactly. And so thankfully, because of that smart decision, we can all enjoy the film and think about its social political situation. And so basically, Chilsu and Mansu is about two working class men. One is older, perhaps in his late 40s or 50s. One is younger, perhaps in his 20s. And they paint. We don't see it now, but like maybe up until the early 90s, something. Film advertisement boards, they were painted by hand, right? Have you seen that before?
Oh, you mean not on the film, but you mean in the street?
Yeah,
So
on the streets and
advertising
on
something.
on like big billboards, like
Yes.
painted by hand, right? Of like the famous actress or something, a poster. We don't see that anymore, but I don't know when that was phased out, maybe in the 90s or something. But these two men, that's their job. That's what they do. And they're disgruntled with life. They're not earning much money. We see a lot of capitalism and money in there. There's the younger guy is dating a university student who's from middle to upper class background. She goes to these expensive department stores. He lies to her and he says, "Oh, he's moving to the USA to live there or study there." Just to try to up his own class or his, his perceived class.
Yeah.
Anyway, so there are very strong comparisons between working class and middle to upper class in the film, in the scenes that are shot. And in the middle or towards the end of the film, the two men are painting. They just start to vent their frustrations. They're high above, on a very high building. Do you know Shinsegae Gangnam department store? There's a express bus terminal there.
Okay, yeah.
It might be that building actually. So they're on this very high building, and just yelling their frustrations to the public down below. And of course, no one can hear them. It's just a way to vent, basically. But then, bit by bit, people start gathering and looking up at them, at these two men yelling. And then the crowd just gets bigger and bigger, and then the police arrives, and people think that they're suicidal, but they're not. And then a police helicopter, arrives as well. To try to get them off. And it's a very good depiction because these two men, they're expressing their frustrations of being a man, of being angry to society, of the kinds of lives that they're leading. But they're totally misunderstood. No one can hear them. They want to be heard and understood, but no one can hear them. And even the police misunderstand them.
Or if they are heard, they're misunderstood by people.
Right, exactly. But in this film, they cannot be heard because of the distance. The public to the building, to them being on top of the building, So this is, an example of angry men and this disconnection that sometimes they feel or felt in life between those people and us in that way.
Does military service play any role in that? Because I'm thinking of Peppermint Candy, these films where a lot of men, they are emasculated or their freedom is taken away in South Korea because of military service.
Right, right. Yeah, that's a very good point. And I'm glad you mentioned Peppermint Candy by Lee Chang-dong. It's one of my favorite films. I think it was made in 1999. And that's a very good point because, Korean men who are able-bodied, have to serve in the military. Before it was about 3 years, they went down to 2.5 years, and I think now it's about 2 years. And I think in that film, Peppermint Candy, Lee Chang-dong, the director, has depicted it so well. Because we see the scene of the protagonist before he joined the military.
Yeah.
He's very innocent. He's dating a woman. They're part of a church. They sing hymns by a river in nature. It's all very pure and innocent.
It's Korean.
Yeah.
When I see it. Yeah.
Right. And then he joins the military, and he ends up being, I think it's around the Gwangju massacre period, if I remember correctly, and he ends up killing a girl, an innocent girl, accidentally. And then from then on, just his life is just downhill, really. And so I've read papers by academics on this topic of the military and how it has affected men, just because of the strong hierarchy system. And people, almost all men that join the military service are in lower positions, and dealing with sometimes physical abuse, if not at least verbal abuse in the military, and what that can do to someone's mentality, over a period of a couple of years as well. And so coming back to that film, Peppermint Candy, after the protagonist finishes the military service, he joins the police force, and there the abuse just continues. So in the military, he had received abuse following other superiors' orders. But then in the position, he has a high position when he joins the police force. And that's when he gives abuse to other people. So for me, when I saw Peppermint Candy, we see an interesting cycle of this innocence of the protagonist before he joined the military. He joins the military, leaves the military, and it's just downhill. And being the victim initially, then becomes the victim becomes the victimizer. So when he's in the police force, he literally, in order to get answers out of someone they've caught, he literally fist someone, like so much pain. And then he's also domestically abusive to his wife as well. So that's an interesting aspect of the victim becoming a victimizer in the way that Lee Chang-dong depicted that in that film.
And that it was because of situations out of their control that the Korean men, they might be angry, but there might be reasons for their anger.
Yeah.
And it's often, I think, I had General Chan Bum on the podcast a long time ago, and he said in a perfect world, it would be the rich and powerful that did the military service because they have everything else going for them. It should be them going to do it, not the people that are already suffering from economic or socio-political oppression. But it's not that way. It's normally the other way around.
Right, exactly. So, also on the topic of, there's also this interesting aspect, about this part of angry men, in Korean New Wave cinema, because either they destruct other people, it could be wives through domestic violence or other people, but self-extermination is also in those films sometimes. So there's a film that was made in 1995, so much later, called A Single Spark, and have you seen that film? It's about Jun Tae-il, who is and was seen as kind of a revolutionary back in, I think, 1970 or the early 70s.
1970, I believe he set himself on fire.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So Jun Tae-il, he is and was a hero. He worked for a factory during the textile industry era, during the Park Chung-hee era, and he noticed that many people, especially women, were mistreated, working long hours for very little pay. If they were sick, they still had to continue working, etc. And so he really tried to stand up to these people, right, and teach people that actually we have the law. And he had a book, right, of rights that the people in the factory did not know about, And so at the end of the film, in A Single Spark, so this incident happened in 1970 when he set fire to himself and died. But this story was brought back in 1995 and became a big hit as a film called A Single Spark. And this is also, yes, of course, he's an angry man. He has a reason to be, and all of them do have reasons to be. But in this film, he exterminates himself.
He's a young man as well.
Yeah,
When we say man, he's 19, I believe. Or,
I'm not sure what his age was, but maybe 19 or early 20s at the
Yeah,
most, I would say.
I think so.
Actually, you know, yeah,
a child almost.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, yeah. And there's there's a funny film that I saw a couple of years ago called on the topic of this angry men called Whale Hunting.
Mhm.
It was made in 1984, and there's kind of this geeky guy in a school who finds it very difficult to pick up women in school. So he feels emasculated, and then he leaves the city, and then in search of a whale at the coast, you know. So it's a literal search for a whale, and also kind of metaphorical in that way, you know. But as far as I remember, he joins forces with another person who is homeless, and they find a woman. So it's the three of them in whale hunting who are on a road trip to leave the city and go into the coast in search of a whale. And what is interesting, you know, in a whale hunting, this film, is at the beginning he's an emasculated guy. No one really wants to date him. Men take the mickey out of him in school, at university or school. But then towards the end of the film, he ends up being a savior to the woman. You know, he helps her to guide her back to her hometown to reunite with her mother as well. So this is another aspect. So either in these films of angry men during the Korean New Wave cinema, they're angry and they either destruct others or, like I said, destruct themselves. And often there's also an aspect of them being a savior to women towards the end as a recuperation of masculinity in that way as well.
Do these men still exist today? The men from Whale Hunting, Chilsu and Mansu, A Single Spark, has Korean New Wave cinema has finished, but do those men still exist today, or are they represented differently? Have you observed anything in the depiction of men in modern Korean cinema?
That's a very good question. I think politics, if we just look at politics recently, let's say in the last couple of years, you know, and when was Yoon Suk-yeol elected? I think 2022, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, most of the people that voted for him were either younger men or older men, right? And Yoon Suk-yeol was very, at the time of his election, before it, you know, he wanted to get rid of the Ministry of Gender, and you know, there's a lot of anti-feminist sentiment, right? You know, so your question is really good, and I'm trying to think of films that may depict this angry male element. And what first comes to mind is Burning. Yeah, 2018, also by Lee Chang-dong.
Brilliant.
As well. It's a great film. And let's see. So there's a man. Yeah, there's a man. What's the actor's name? I mean, Yoo In is more from the working class.
Stephen Yeun?
Stephen Yeun, yeah, that's right. Yeah. So there's Stephen Yeun, who's a richer man, right? He drives a Porsche. And then the actor Yoo In is a working class man. And getting jobs is difficult, right? I'm thinking of the film now, and for the protagonist that Yoo In plays, I remember he works in a factory initially and ends up leaving. I think he wants to be a writer, but it's not easy to become a writer. His father has been in and out of prison as well. So you know, we see from the character that Yoo In is playing that he has financial difficulties. He's from a working class background, from parents that have had issues as well. And a spoiler alert, you know, at the end of the film, he actually ends up getting revenge, right, or takes out vengeance on Stephen Yeun, who is a far more successful male with money, lots of free time. Where he gets his money, we don't know. But he lives in a nice apartment. He drives a Porsche. He travels abroad, you know, things like that. So that's one example that comes to mind. about on the topic of angry men.
Just as it's very good, and there's not just a single spark in Burning, there are many sparks.
Mm.
On the last, maybe closing out this idea of masculinity, when we watch these movies, certainly the ones that I've seen of them, and I'm thinking of short stories of that time as well, it's almost as if we're not meant to hate these men, we're not meant to like these men, but we're meant to understand their socio-political position. We're meant to see the sources of their oppression and the sources of their anger, resentment, maybe why domestic violence is carried out or why self-violence is carried out. So it's a very ambiguous political position, I think, that it takes on that, isn't it, Nilesh? Or how do
Absolutely.
you see that? Because
Yeah.
we're not meant to hate them or love them, but we're meant to see them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there's not a often in these films, for example, in Chilsu and Mansu, these films, including Chilsu and Mansu, there's not a dichotomy between who is good and bad. When we view Chilsu and Mansu, we feel sorry for the men and the situation that they're in. But at the same time, we also understand the development of Korea and the development it needs to go through to become a richer and more successful country through the late 80s through into the 90s. So I would say quite a neutral perspective in that way. Yeah, and then if we think about a film much later, like Burning from 2018, yeah, we the film creates understanding, to the working class protagonists, right?
Yeah.
But then there's not a, even though Stephen Yun is in a very different position, he's not depicted in such a negative light either, I think.
He might be the good guy.
Yeah.
We're not quite sure what.
Yeah, or at least he creates some kind of admiration
Yeah.
for his lifestyle. The fact that he has money and we don't know where it comes from, but he has a lot of free time. He can enjoy good food, drive a nice car, things like that. So there's also an element of admiration that we can obtain from that film as well, right?
Is it not the same in Parasite, where it's not exactly clear who the good people and bad people are?
Exactly, right? Yeah.
Because the poor people are going around killing.
Exactly.
And yet you feel for them and you understand the hardships they're going through, the oppression, the looks they receive, the aggressions, the smells, and such forth.
Exactly. Whereas the richer people, the richer family, the Parks, I think, they are depicted as a bit more two-dimensional, I'd say, in the film compared to the working class family, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because this two-dimensional depiction, there's a slight innocence in the way that they're depicted. I remember there's a scene where the mother from the working class family is talking to someone, and she's like, "Why are they so kind?" Especially referring to the upper class mother.
Yeah.
And the response she hears is, "Oh, they can be so kind. They have nothing to worry about in that way."
Yeah.
Because the mother is very just polite and nice.
Easily duped.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's this naivety there, right? This innocence and naivety in that Park upper class family.
Are they kind because they're rich, or are they rich because they're kind? Is one of the questions that keeps coming back. I think you do a Marxist analysis on that, of how economic status affects your morality.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And so, and you mentioned how the working class family, they're killing each other, and a word that comes to mind is competition, right? Because competition is something that things boil down to, in a way. The working class family in Parasite are competing for money. They need to earn more money. So they're also competing with the other working class family living in the basement, right?
Competing for Wi-Fi, competing for pizza boxes.
Right, exactly. Yeah. In Chilsu and Mansu from 1988, there's a clear class difference, and the working class men trying to earn more money. Because other people are shopping in expensive department stores, wearing nice clothes, studying abroad, etc. So competition is also an aspect that creates these tensions, right?
Yeah.
Chilsu
and Mansu is definitely on my list. Another term that you've introduced me to, Nilesh, which I hadn't heard of before, which was hostess cinema. So you've written about this idea of female sacrifice as a recurring theme in South Korean cinema. Tell us about Hostess cinema. Open this door for us, please. Let's turn the attention now from the angry men as they were depicted to the females as they're depicted.
Right. So the hostess cinema genre is quite fascinating. It started in 1974 and then ended in 1982. So just from 74 to 82, that was its period. Your question was?
Tell me about Hostess cinema. Teach me something about it. And then let's go towards Sopyeonjae and My Sassy Girl, how females are portrayed.
Okay, so first of all, regarding Hostess cinema, what is interesting is about the politics at the time and how it was born based on the politics of the time. So Park Chung-hee started in 61. And in 61, also prostitution was made illegal as well. But what is interesting, I have an interesting fact here. Right, so, okay, before we get on to Hostess cinema properly, we have to kind of look at what was happening before 1974, right? So, the 1960s through Park Chung-hee and his government was a time of rapid industrialization, right? A lot of people from the countryside were moving to large cities like Seoul and Busan to work in factories, to work in the booming economies. And there's an interesting statistic I have here where in 1960, 26% of laborers were female, moving to the cities like Seoul. Later in 1976, the number increased to 45%. So there was a massive increase of females moving from the countryside, their hometowns, to cities like Seoul to look for work, especially in factories. And this period was such a big period of growth. And that's what Park Chung-hee is also known for contributing to nationwide, financial growth, right? The GDP. And so I have a fact here, like from 1961 to 81, the GNP tripled from $471 in 61 to $1,500 in 81. So massive, And so the reason for this is, these people coming from the countryside, moving to cities to work in factories. So textiles were a big part of the reason, garment production, agriculture, fishery, and also mining. Now, coming back to the element of prostitution. So in 61, there were laws preventing prostitution. But then as more and more women started moving to the cities, the situation changed. There was also the Vietnam War. And, Park Chung-hee and his government were smart. They sent soldiers there and got money back in American dollars. And that helped in terms of money for the government to make as well. But an interesting fact, in 1972, there were Japanese tourists coming in the early 70s. And in 1972, they recorded the Japanese tourist numbers, mostly male businessmen from Japan, as 96,000. And the government thought, how can we increase these number of Japanese businessmen coming in? And so they decided to reintroduce prostitution by creating a special law for it, by creating a special work permit in 1973. So this work permit would allow female sex workers to go to hotels to serve foreign tourists. So this was a legal work permit from 1973. And it served the country very well in that way in terms of tourism or business tourists, especially coming from Japan. So like I said, in 72, the initial number was 96,000 Japanese, mostly men coming in. With the introduction of this sex working work permit 1 year later in 73, that number increased to 217,000. So a huge boost in sex tourism, because of this legal work permit, And
there's something sensitive in it, Nilesh, that it's directed towards Japan as well.
I know, right?
Because of what had happened during colonization time, or the
comfort women.
With the comfort women or the sex slaves, however they're termed. It's almost reopening or reserving or revisiting that particular element, isn't it?
Exactly. In fact, that is Japan and Japanese men, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, it must have been a very, an open wound in a way, because I mean, the whole comfort women situation, and the war just ended in 45, and this in the early 70s is not that much of a period gap, really. Yeah. Although we must also keep in mind that even though there were approximately 200,000 comfort women, sent for the Japanese military, um, those were all living in silence after 1945 until around the early 90s, if I remember correctly. So, kind of from after 1945 to the early 90s, no one really knew or talked about comfort women. It wasn't a thing or normal thing that people knew about.
So this highlights the silence or the blindness to that topic
Yes.
more than the sensitivity depths.
Exactly. I think so. It's more the blindness,
Yeah.
like you said. Yeah, exactly. So, on one hand, the government is looked at ways of cashing in with these Japanese businessmen coming here with these sex work permits. So the government cashed in on that. At the same time, I mentioned earlier how there were a lot of women moving from the countryside to cities like Seoul to work in factories. Now, these women were from working class backgrounds, and one of the reasons for them to move to the cities was to earn more money, of course, so that they could send part of that money back to their poor families in the countryside. So either their families, so for example, their parents were suffering financially, so from their weekly or monthly paychecks, they would send a percentage back, or in other cases, they would have brothers in the countryside. And the money that these young girls or younger women would earn would go to their brothers' education, for the brothers to be able to pay for tuition for university. Because sons were always first in terms of the choice of who to send to university, right? The sons go first. If we have money left over, daughters can have a chance. So the problem was that there were some working class women who moved to cities like Seoul that started working in factories or did some domestic work, such as taking care of the homes for
Housemaids,
exactly, housemaids,
which is a film I was
right,
going to ask you
exactly,
about.
yeah. So they took these jobs, but then some of these younger women, they realized, "Oh, actually, I'm not earning enough money, for myself and to save and to send back to my family back in my hometown." And so some women realized, actually, they could earn more money from the sex industry. Some women went full time into the sex industry, but a lot of women did it part time. So they would continue with their day job of, being a housemaid or working in a factory or a store as their day job, but then work as a sex worker on a part time basis. And the benefit of that compared to a full time sex worker was they would perhaps be able to choose their clients. They'll be able to choose their working hours, so just is a bit more favorable. So maybe they didn't really want to do that, of course, but they could earn money far more easily, a much higher rate as well. And so these were interesting factors, the government laws regarding sex work coinciding with the needs of certain working class women as well. And so coming back to film, and how does Hostess cinema tie in with this? So because of Park Chung-hee's government, there are so many film laws changed a lot in the period that he was the president from 61 to 79. And there were certain periods where film laws became very strict. And for example, in the early 70s, film laws became so strict that they were too strict. And so the cinema industry was declining. And so they thought, how can we boost the cinema industry? And they noticed, well, we have a new sex law. Since the late 60s, more and more room salons, brothels had been opening up, thriving more in the early and mid 70s. The sex industry was just growing, sex as a commodity, working class women as a commodity. It was just growing in the early to mid 70s. So they thought, oh, why don't we turn this into a genre? And so this is what we call hostess cinema, from 74 to 82, like I'd mentioned, And what I find interesting if we watch these films, for example, I think probably the most prominent, well-known film is called Yeong-ja's Heyday, from this hostess cinema genre. And what is the way that the films are made and edited is very interesting, because they would not, legally, because of film rules, they would not necessarily be allowed to show a woman completely naked in front of the camera. So what were some ways that they could go around this? And often cameras zoomed into parts of naked women, like her thigh or her stomach, or maybe part of the breast or foot or hand. So this was a way of sexualizing and commodifying women, working class women, in cinema by zooming in on parts of their body. That was one aspect. The second aspect was silencing them. So often when we see sex scenes in these hostess cinema films, sound just goes away. It's just silence. Yeah. So all of the focus becomes very visual. You don't hear anything. And,
must be very uncomfortable.
I mean, it could be, but 98% of the film is sound, right? We hear people speaking, or even background sounds of traffic, or whatever it may be. But then all of a sudden, sounds disappear, and we just see these body parts of skin of these working class women who are sex workers. So that's a way to make the image even more powerful. To make this commodity of the female body even more powerful as well. So the male gaze was very strong in that way, in the way that these films were edited and made. And made by men, of course, But films like Yeong-ja's Heydays, they became very popular, from the research I had done, very popular with women, especially working class women. And even with Yeong-ja's Heydays, before it became a film, there was a book about it. And the book was a massive seller. The films were a big hit in the cinema because it's something that some working class women could relate to. Even if some working class women had not become sex workers themselves, they could perhaps relate to aspects like, yes, I have moved to the city. Yes, I'm having hardships living in the city. I'm having difficulty making enough money to survive and send money back to my poor family. I'm missing my family. I'm alone in the city and people are trying to take advantage of me. There are things that working class women could relate to, even if they had not become a sex worker as well. So they were very successful with women, but also with men because of the male gaze, the sexualization. And there's a term that there was a feminist, a sociologist that I came across. Her name is Kathleen Barry. She's an American feminist sociologist, and she used the term industrialization of sex. And I think this term by Kathleen Barry, industrialization of sex, is a good way to sum up what we've talked about so far. The fact that legally the Park Chung-hee government made prostitution legal. And there was a big industry that facilitated this, that women also needed as well for money as well. And then finally, the hostess cinema genre also cashed in on this industry as well. And there's just one more thing that comes to mind as well. How, if we think about the editing and how they're shot with these hostess cinema films, there are often shots where the camera we see the POV, the perspective from the policeman, and they're trying to catch some prostitutes on back alleys. But the POV is just from the policeman, and there we see their hands grabbing women. So the women who are, kind of screaming and trying to run away, but being grabbed at by policemen's hands, they become objects in that moment. So quite powerful images, and the women are just grabbed and we see them screaming or trying to run away. So it's almost like an animal that has caught its prey. And Yeong-ja's Heyday has that element very strongly, especially in the beginning of the film. And then there's a scene also in Yeong-ja's Heyday where Yeong-ja is the main character who becomes a sex worker, but before she becomes a sex worker. I think she had worked in a factory for a bit. She became a housemaid. But while she was a housemaid for this middle to upper class family, she was repeatedly raped by the son. And when she's being raped, often the POV is from the son's perspective, raping her. So again, there's this objectification of the victim being raped. And there's a scene where the camera is far higher looking down on Yeong-ja as the woman being raped. So there's a lot of objectification, in these types of films, a lot of male gaze there, which could be quite comfortable for some people to watch in that way, yeah. But it was a normal thing from 74 to 82, actually.
Do any elements of that hostess cinema or those female characters exist? Has that carried on? Because the sex slave still exists in South Korea. We can see, although it's less visible than when I first arrived 20 years ago, sort of the Chongyangni, the Yongsan, they've gone to a certain extent, but the industry still exists. Do we still see depictions of that? Because there's a lot of sort of strong female characters portraying an ideal ego for people, so women can watch and they can see female characters do all the things that they couldn't do in their real lives. So the young girl in Itaewon Class being the youngest but taking over the bar, Han So-hee in My Name beating up gangsters and things like this, and we will come to My Sassy Girl. But does any of that consist or persist today of hostess cinema, or is it of the time so much that we don't see it now?
I would say it's more of the time, actually. And if we do see it now, for example, there's an independent filmmaker who I really admire called Kim Kyung-wook. And in the last few years, I think perhaps before COVID, he made a documentary, which I screened at the underground cinema that I ran. And this was a documentary about female sex workers. Where is it? I think around Hapjeong Station. There's a big department store, isn't there? What's the name? Something Times Square.
That's by Yoido and Yoinaro.
Yeah, Yoinaro maybe. Yeah, there's a department store called Times Square. Right. And so this was shot, I think, just before the department store was open.
Big red light district next to it.
Yeah, that's where it was shot.
You have to drive past it to go to your department store, and the dichotomy just blew my mind.
Is it still there, or you're talking about that time?
It was there, let's say 7-8 years ago.
Oh,
it might have been cleaned up by now.
So he's made a documentary about that era, about that street, and the female sex workers working on that street. So he interviewed them, and their background and how they ended up there, and how they didn't want this street to close down, but they had no option because of this big department store and commercialization going on. So, as far as we would have to double check regarding your question of the depiction of sex workers now, because I'm not 100% sure about that right now. But as far as I know, it'd be more towards a documentary element rather than this industrialization of sex and these women as a commodity that was depicted during the hostess cinema period.
Which just reflects, I think, Korea's changing socio-economic things, but also its values, its culture.
Yes.
And the role of women in society.
Exactly.
Which brings me to a film that I didn't really expect to read in your work, which was My Sassy Girl.
Yeah.
Tell us something about My Sassy Girl, Nilesh.
Yeah, sure. Before we move on to My Sassy Girl, I just had a couple of quick thoughts on hostess cinema.
Good, please.
Yeah, just one was, because you kind of mentioned about the empowerment of women, right? More in recent times through cinema or screen culture. And something that comes to mind is in the last couple of years, I saw a film by Hong Sang-soo, and which was with Kim Min-hee. And I forgot the name of the film, but in this film, she's with her Korean friends, and the character had been living in Berlin or somewhere in Germany, and and she just openly talks about her sexual experience with German men, with her Korean friends, and there's no shame attached to it at all, from her friends or herself. So this is an element of empowerment, I think, for a woman to just talk about her sex life and who she slept with and what kind of sex she's experienced with men, So that's something that comes to mind with that on the topic.
To make this timely, Yoon Yo-jung came out today and said that her son is in a same-sex marriage. Yoon Yo-jung, the famous actress, she was recently in Minari and
Yeah,
things like that.
yeah.
She said that today.
Today, really?
Yes.
I didn't know that. That's great. We need more of
Timing
this.
that, yes. I think
Excellent.
Yoon is a person that doesn't really worry too much about social perception and nunchi and things like this. She seems to be herself.
Yeah. But I mean, especially after Minari, I mean, she has always been so well respected, but
Yeah.
Minari just took it to another level when was it released? Like 3-4 years ago, maybe.
At least.
During COVID, I think.
Yeah.
And then, she got so much work in adverts, like Samsung and everything, right? Which was great.
Well deserved.
But, people respected her before Minari, and then the respect just went up like a few notches. So I think for a woman of that level of respect to say this is much easier to come out regarding her son, right? Which can then have a trickle effect of just understanding and acceptance for other people who are not celebrities, right?
Because she's such a powerful or an influential or a well-known and well-respected figure, for her to say that, my family were talking about it this morning over breakfast, and if it was someone of lesser stature, it might not have been as high up the news headlines or something like this. And so I think it is, her voice is important.
Exactly. Very right. And, on this topic before Sassy Girl, another film that comes to mind is something I saw on Netflix within the last year or so. Maybe you can help me remember the name. It's related to the sex industry and Korean women caught in it. So these younger Korean women in this film, is a Netflix production, are they end up trapped in the sex industry where they have to work as sex workers. And there's this whole organization of men who make money from them. It's called the Ballerina. I think it's called Ballerina, I think.
I don't know it.
Yeah. So basically, there's this the protagonist is a female Korean woman. And her friend was a ballerina. And her ballerina friend ended up getting caught in this sex ring or trafficking, whatever it was. And she ends up dying from it. And so this female protagonist goes on a search, like, what happened to my friend? Why did she die? Who killed her? What happened? And in her journey of discovery, she ends up finding, oh, my friend had ended up in some kind of like sex worker entrapment, situation. And she discovers there are all these other younger Korean women who are part of this sex working scheme. And so she ends up she's this very strong character that literally fights physically with weapons and without weapons and attacks these Korean men who are the founders and leaders of this sex work industry.
Wow.
Yeah, so and that just came out in the last maybe 2 years on Netflix. It wasn't a big success.
A mask or something. It sounds very familiar now.
Maybe, yeah. It might have been called the Ballerina Girl, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's another example of a topic that talks about sex work and the topic of sex. That some Korean women have had to deal with. But then in this film, the protagonist is a woman that literally fights and gets justice on the men, that have done these wrongdoings.
Generally, I think there's more happy endings now. And I don't say that as an allusion to anything else. What I mean to say is that these dramas and movies, when they depict it now, the woman is a girl boss, queen don't cry. She goes in there, she kicks ass and she takes names. Whereas perhaps in the past, there would have been more of a ambiguous or even a sad ending, I think. And maybe we expect good endings now, or we expect resolution or the good guys to win. But I don't think that's always the case. And so those depictions, I remember watching Hangongju, which is about the Miryangji rape case. It was a movie made about that, and I had no idea what it was just going into it. And very powerful movie. And what you've talked about today, Nilesh, I think it reinforces the fact that a lot of these instances and what goes on, the finger can't always be pointed abroad at the United States or Japan, which it very commonly is, because there's a whole industry that exists here today, from what might have been sort of maybe more playful or innocent tabangs selling tickets, coffee shops, all the way up to enslavement.
Exactly. And that's a good point you've made. Like, these days there's more happy endings, solid conclusions in that way.
Vicarious satisfaction.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Yes. Yeah, vicarious. Yeah, and but then if we think about Hostess cinema and the endings that were common in Hostess cinema, very different actually. In these films, often these sex worker women. Now, first of all, the sex worker women were not depicted as bad people. They were actually depicted as innocent young women, who were trying to do the best, filial piety. They were trying to support their poor families. They're trying to earn money and just do their best living in these kind of dog eat dog world cities, right? So they're not depicted in a bad light. But at the end of the film, most of the time, these women either end up getting killed or end up getting sick or losing an arm or just go missing. So they are wiped out, So, they serve a purpose in the film. They are providing entertainment, sexual satisfaction to men. They are providing money to the economy. Hopefully also money to the families back home as well. But then they're very commodified. Once their part is done, they're killed. They disappear. So that's interesting from conclusions now.
I think so. Similar to the way that men were required to do military service for the nation, that there was some kind of expectation for women to do that. I just finished reading this selection of short stories by Yi Chan-dong. I was telling you before we came on, and none of those had happy endings. There is one about a girl working in a tabang shop and the Minjung people, these oppressed people from the 80s. The stories don't end happily, and I was worried that after reading one that I might spiral into depression. Like, can I really endure all this? But actually I found a great value in it, not as a form of sort of torture porn or whatever it might be, but it generated more empathy. It generated a more powerful story than a Cinderella ending where the good guys win or justice is served, because if we believe that's the case, we don't go out into society and try and do anything about it. We need to see the injustice, perhaps.
Exactly, and to have an understanding and some empathy, right?
Yeah.
To what people go through, really. And this is a very powerful element, empathy, that film can potentially produce and give people, right?
Yeah.
So we can come to Sassy Girl if you like.
I would like to hear something about it, because I've shown it before in class about the changing representation of women in my Hallyu classes, and this stars Jung Ji-hyun, who since went on to become a global megastar. And it just feels very weird to put it in the context of what we've spoken about.
But it's related, I suppose, because it's about female representation and empowerment or not empowerment as well, right? So yeah, My Sassy Girl is interesting. It came out in 2001, right? It was in 2001. Massive hit. Massive hit in Korea. And I found an interesting thing in my research about this before I wrote the paper. And I found that when it came out in Korea, it was far more successful than people give it credit for. I found it. So they sold more tickets than Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, firstly. Secondly, more popular than Lord of the Rings.
Oh, wow.
And thirdly, also more popular than Titanic. So it was a massive hit in Korea, and not just in South Korea, but there are other countries in Asia that some countries made their own version of it. So here I have China, Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Thailand, and Nepal had made their own versions of it.
That's amazing.
So it had a ripple effect.
It's Hallyu before Hallyu, or it's Asia K where it existed.
Seriously, And if people haven't seen My Sassy Girl, I strongly recommend people watch it, because it says a lot. I think it's kind of has two. One is it's very entertaining.
Yeah.
So if you just want something light to relax to after a hard day at work or school, watch it and you can relieve stress. But secondly, you can also, if you want to, you can also kind of delve a bit deeper into the film as well, And My Sassy Girl, so to put it short, it's what happens at the beginning of the film. A man is at the subway station, right? Yeah. He's waiting for the subway. He sees a drunk woman, and she's so drunk that she's about to fall onto the subway tracks. And the train is approaching, and then he saves her from falling and getting hit, right? And then she's really drunk, and I think he takes her home and just makes sure she's okay, you know. So that's the beginning of the film, right? And then later we see them dating, and that's, you know, going on for dinners and things like that, you know. And I think this is a very interesting film, but it's difficult to know where to start. But first of all, the way that the woman is depicted is just so different from most films, right?
I'd just say one thing. And
Yeah,
I think in an earlier era, he might have taken advantage of that woman or something like that. So it's also representing something about the man, because here is an unconscious woman, beautiful, but unable to stand, unconscious, essentially, and yet nothing untoward happens. From the man's part and from the woman's.
right.
And it's the woman that's blind drunk, not the man.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, very good point. Yeah. Yeah, because earlier it would have been the man who's drunk, and the woman probably would have been taken advantage of in some way, right? Yeah, exactly. So I mean, on this topic regarding I mean, we can talk about the depiction of the female character and also the male character as well. So just to give people insight into the female character, so she's loud, she's boisterous, she clearly asks for what she wants, she has no hesitation, she's very confident. She drinks a lot, she can drink more than the guy that she's dating. So, you know, she has a lot of these masculine characteristics, right? She's very outwardly, she looks very feminine. She has long hair. She has female appearance that many men would appreciate, you know. But character-wise, she's very masculine in that way. So, yeah, so there are two things that we can talk about My Sassy Girl, and one is also when it was launched. So, you know, it came out in 2001. So this was just after the Asian financial crisis, right? People and the country were kind of recovering. And there's a paper that I had read before I wrote my own paper, when I was researching on this film and topic. An academic had written about types of men, three general types of men, from two of them from the Joseon Dynasty era. So the writer talked about hegemonic masculinity from the Joseon Dynasty first. Second, sunbi masculinity. And thirdly, a more recent one in that era, konminam. Am I pronouncing it correctly?
Zombie would be sort of an academic, a literate person, and a kominam would be a flower boy.
Exactly, yeah. So the writer basically summarized. So the first one, the hegemonic masculinity, it's kind of the typical man. It doesn't mean they need to beat up people, but you know, there's a certain machismo attached to them. They will not, and this is from the Joseon era, so they will not do housework. They will not clean, cook. They do things that men do. You know,
they would have multiple wives.
The richer
slaves,
ones. Would have slaves and multiple wives. You know, so there was a machismo attached to this, from the Joseon Dynasty to the current period of 2001 at that time. So that's the first type. And then the second one that you mentioned about sunbi, which is more intellectual, academic, right?
Yeah.
So these were men also from the Joseon Dynasty that were well educated, the Yangban, that were gentlemanly. You know, they had respect to people and women. Again, they will stick to the male roles. They will not do housework or cleaning, cooking, etc. But intellectual, refined, polite. You know. And then finally, the flower boys, the konminam, right? The pretty boys that we've seen in BTS, in 2PM, and lots of other boy bands, and Wang Namja, what's the name? King and the Clown, Kim Jun-hee? Kim Jun-hee. Yeah, the actor. Yeah, you know, these examples of flower boys, right? You know. And so in one of the papers I read, it talked about this era of the Asian financial crisis, you know, and how there was also a lot of emasculation coming out of this financial crisis. Yeah, a lot of men lost their jobs, right? They had been the breadwinners, but are no longer the breadwinners. There are also a lot of men who had high positions in companies as executives or managerial positions, and they just lost those positions and they became taxi drivers or, you know, had to work in stores and restaurants, things like that, you know. So there's a lot of emasculation coming from that as well. And so the writer talked about then being a need also for a different type of man to exist, a different type of depiction.
Mm.
You know, men could no longer just be the breadwinners and be strong and have command over the house and everything, you know. And so this is when the flower boys, the pretty boys, started to come about,
Mhm.
you know. And so if we come back to the film, My Sassy Girl, so the male protagonist, his name is Gyonu.
Mhm.
Gyonu, that's his name. And you know, he's not a pretty boy. He's not a typical flower boy, but he has aspects of them. You know, he's soft. There's a certain passive element he has
Mhm.
compared to the woman that he's dating, especially. He's far less patriarchal, you know. So this film is important because the man is far less macho. Like you said earlier, he's not taking advantage of this drunk woman.
Mm.
He's not drunk himself. He can't be as drunk as the woman. He can't compete. Also, you know. So we're seeing a change of direction in the depiction of women, and My Sassy Girl has an element of this as well. Um, so the woman in My Sassy Girl, in a way, we can praise her because she's so confident, she's so bold. She goes against the grain of what women were expected to behave like, right?
Mm.
So we can praise her, we can admire her. At the same time, if we think about Gyonu, the male protagonist, her boyfriend or you know her date, he's actually a victim in a way. You know, he gets verbal abuse.
Physical
Sometimes,
abuse.
yeah, and sometimes physical abuse, emotional abuse. You know,
Yeah.
whereas you know if the roles were reversed, it would not be acceptable. You know, but in this case, it's kind of comical.
Mm.
The man is getting physically abused, verbally, emotionally abused, but it's comical. There's a comedy element.
And it's
in this.
comedy of the time.
Of the
I
time.
I think of that
Yeah.
90s, 2000s. Comedy was a bit like that.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, that's right. So the roles have reversed
Mm.
anyway in that way. So this is fun, interesting element, you know. But then later, as the story progresses, we realize actually the woman we thought that was confident, bold, is actually not so much
Mm.
the case. You know, they're at a mountain and far away from each other, and she yells something to him, and she says something like, "Oh, Gyonu, you know, I feel so, something like I feel so lost. I'm not the confident girl that you think I am."
Mm.
So she's showing that she's actually very vulnerable, and the confidence and the boldness that she is just a front. It's a front basically, and that's what we learn as the viewers as well. You know, um, yeah, and so initially, like coming back to Gyonu, the male protagonist, during their dating period, we also kind of learn how much of a loser he is in a way. You know, he can't fight. He's not good at things like taekwondo or martial arts. He can't swim. He wants to be a writer, but he doesn't really have any skill in that.
Mm.
You know, so he's kind of a no-hoper.
Yeah.
Whereas the girl he's dating, she wants to be a writer. She's strong. You know, we see hope in her. you
She
know.
saves him.
Yeah,
He needs to be saved.
yeah, that's right. That's right. And that's what we think the story is about until kind of the halfway point, and there's a change
Mm.
in the story, you know. And what I said to you, you know, when she screams to him, but he can't hear her because he's at the other side of the mountain, like, oh, actually, I'm not so confident. I'm actually quite vulnerable. She reveals, you know, that she's not such a bold, confident person inside. And at that point, that's when the things change. And they have a separation period of about 2 years.
Mm.
And so, in that 2 year period, Gyonu, he starts to take martial art lessons. He becomes stronger and also adept at martial arts.
Mm.
He takes swimming lessons. He can swim. He starts to write about the experience of dating the woman. And then he writes and his skills develop.
Mm.
And he ends up selling this. He writes it, I think, as a blog initially.
That's right.
You know, blogs were actually the thing back in the early 2000s, right? And so he keeps it as a blog, but then someone finds it and they want to turn his blogs into a film or a TV series. So during this 2 year separation period, the male Gyonu, he has learned and expanded so much. He's become a stronger male, physically stronger, mentally more stable. In terms of his career, he's going places, making money as well, So he has completely changed in this 2-year separation period. And then towards the end of the film, they reunite. And we learn that in that 2-year period, actually, the woman still wants to be a writer, but she still doesn't really have the skill for it. She hasn't really grown as a person. So we learn at the end of the film that actually the woman, she was kind of almost like an angel that came to help this man go from kind of being a loser to becoming someone and something. She was the instigator. The catalyst. Yeah, exactly. And what is interesting is this story of My Sassy Girl. It comes from a story that was released about 2,500 years ago. Not just in Korea, but it's an East Asian tale. I forgot the name of it right now. But it's a 2,500 East Asian folk tale. Yeah, and to be brief, it's about a man, a physical human male, who is visited by this kind of angelic female being who helps him to become successful. And then she disappears, So if we think about this a bit more deeply, again, we can relate this to emasculation, right? Yeah, emasculation has been a recurring theme in Korean cinema. And then the Asian financial crisis, I mean, the Korean New Wave in the 80s and 90s, we see elements of emasculation in that. In the Asian financial crisis, in reality, there was emasculation there. But then in this film, in My Sassy Girl, we initially see this amazing, bold, confident woman that ends up not really growing. And we realize that actually she's quite weak and vulnerable and a softie inside. It's all a facade. But in that period, the man grows. He becomes successful internally and externally. And so he's no longer emasculated. He has recuperated his masculinity. And the woman has served to recuperate that masculinity, which has been a recurring trope in Korean cinema. So that's one interesting factor in that way. And then a second interesting factor is about suicide. There's a fact that I had found here. Right. Okay. So we learn in My Sassy Girl that this woman, before she met Gyonu, she had had an ex-boyfriend. He had committed suicide, and obviously affected her a lot. And it's part of the reason why she has just become this strong, don't mess with me person, right? And then, do you remember the scene when I think they go on a date to a theme park at night?
Yeah, and it turns into
illegally
the Terminator or the Matrix or something like that,
right.
Isn't it? Yes, I do.
Right. They break into a theme park at night when it's not open. Because I think Gyonu. Anyway, it's like an exciting date. Doing something you're not supposed to do, adventurous. But what happens is there's a guy hiding out there. He's a soldier hiding out in that theme park, and the police or the military police are looking for him, right? And so this soldier, he ends up holding the woman as a hostage, and we find out that he's also suicidal, the soldier. So in My Sassy Girl, even though it's a comedy and seemingly a light film, we have two examples of suicide already in this film, One is very personal to the woman. The second is a happening, in this situation, right? So on the topic of suicide, like I found an interesting statistic in my research, and I found that between 1986 and 2005, the suicide in South Korea, increased by 98% for men. So between 86 and 2005, 98%. And for women, even more, 124% for women. And those who were under 45 years old had a far higher chance of suicide as well. So I just find it well done, like hats off to the director and his team to be able to put this aspect of suicide and emasculation, within this fun, easy to digest film, actually.
which is a film that I think many people forget about. You know, we sometimes get lost in the present day, but like you say, 2001, addressing the changing socio-political changes. And what I love, Nilesh, every time I ask you about a movie, before you tell me about the movie, you tell me about how the country has changed and how these movies almost reflect the changes that are taking place. And it makes things make much more sense. It was also very interesting how we'd almost come full circle because you said in Chilsu and Mansu, they stand on top of the sort of department store building and they shout out, but because of the distance, nobody can hear them. And then we've got to My Sassy Girl and she's on top of a mountain confessing how vulnerable she is. And it's all just a front and yet nobody can hear. So it's about these sort of these voices that are spoken but not heard.
Right.
And there's a lovely aspect in that people are talking, or it's not that they're silenced all the time, but it's that they're unable to be heard, maybe because of physical distance, psychological, emotional, economic.
But they are voicing themselves.
But they are voicing,
which is important.
And we are hearing it, we are seeing it if nobody else is.
Right.
And so we're going to go, and you can jump back if you want, but I want to go from that then into the queer as our hero.
Oh, before we jump into the queer as our hero, just another thing that has come to mind about My Sassy Girl. I found the quote. So when she's on the mountain and Gyun-hoo, her boyfriend, can't hear her, she screams, "I can't help it. I thought I was different, but I'm just a helpless girl." Now, in this film, in the story, we also get to visit her parents' home.
That's right.
She lives with her parents. And we learn that her father is actually an alcoholic. And he's very commanding. So he actually has, he embodies this hegemonic masculinity. Like when she's having dinner with her father and mother at home, her mother's very silent. He becomes angry, and you can see the mother is very passive and afraid of her husband. And her husband is just this overbearing, patriarchal figure that drinks too much, that controls the house, that makes decisions for the family, right, rather than with them. And, she, as the daughter, has also just tried to... He's been the only kind of strong role model she's had. Her mother has been seemingly too quiet and passive for her to admire. She's in the house, in her family home, the father has been the role model, who is this strong, or seemingly strong, seemingly confident person, right? So that's an interesting aspect, I think, for us viewers to contrast the hegemonic masculinity of the father versus the more flower boy aspects, not physically, but characteristically, that her boyfriend Gyun-hoo embodies.
And how she tries to embody her father outside of the house, but she's also her mother.
Yes,
deep inside.
That's right, deep inside. So it's a very layered film, And like I said at the beginning, one can truly just enjoy it. To just relieve stress and have fun, nothing more. But if you start to look at the context that the film was made in terms of suicide and just coming out of the Asian financial crisis and masculinity and how to recuperate masculinity, it's a very layered film, right? There's just so much you can talk about and like pause and rewatch and everything.
And it reminds us that deep films or films that we do analyze, they don't always have to be dark. We sometimes, we gravitate towards the Parasites, the Squid Games, the Old Boys, and some of those are genuinely interesting, deep, like high information movies. But it doesn't mean things that are light are the opposite all the time. Things can be critical and philosophical and convey socio-economic or cultural messages and still be comedy.
Absolutely.
And I think My Sassy Girl is one of those, and my students love it when I play it, which is important sometimes. It needs to get across.
It does, yeah. And that's the benefit of these mainstream films. The fact that they can get out to the masses, to millions, to get certain messages across through entertainment, right? And it makes what you've said about comedy and the lightness that some films like My Sassy Girl can have, because it's the comedy or the lightness that allows them to seep into homes and people's minds, right? And it makes me think of Chilsu and Mansu, because the director of that film, he, in an interview, he said how he deliberately put in more comedy aspects at the beginning of the film
Mm.
to draw people into the lightness, and then later incorporated more social political elements once they were
Yeah.
captured by the comedy and the lightness.
And the
anyway,
defenses, psychological
Are
defenses are down, and
Exactly.
then you hit them. I
Exactly.
mean, it's Monty Python, it's George Carlin. You make them laugh, and then you tell them an uncomfortable truth,
Exactly.
and that truth goes deeper.
Yeah, exactly. And so My Sassy Girl is very successful with that.
Mm. And one last thing I would say, which is not a deep analysis, but it just reminds people of Jang Ji-hyun didn't suddenly emerge out of nowhere. And it's so interesting to me that we think Hallyu or Korean wave is new, but it's not. And it's been like in the 2000s, it was becoming hugely popular in parts of East Asia, Southeast Asia, as you said. It's always been here, and it was here in the 60s and 70s. And we get a little bit lost on, no, it started with BTS or it started here, which is definitely not
It's
the
quite
case.
blurry, though, actually.
It's quite blurry, but there's a deep heritage here that's worth understanding.
Absolutely.
The waves are crashing today, but underneath the waves, there's a big riptide of things that have happened before.
Exactly. And the reason Oldboy became Oldboy and such a hit internationally, is because there were things that came before that, right? Yeah, that predated it, right?
Exactly.
In terms of the influx of a Hollywood cinema, in terms of what the Korean New Wave was providing or not providing as well.
And by pushing back against allegory or things that had happened in the past to become what it is now.
Exactly. And ready to embrace a new type of cinema, a new way of telling story as well, right?
Always reacting against different things.
Yes.
So now we've already mentioned actually Wang and Namja, The King and the Clown,
which was 2005.
2005. It was the first movie that I ever saw in a Korean cinema, and I had no idea what I was going to see, and I went with a girlfriend of the time, and I might have told this story before, but before we went in, there was lots of fortune tellers next to the cinema because it was a dating thing, and
it was quite normal then.
It was quite normal then, little sort of stands. And when we went in, they'd oversold tickets, so we sat on the floor.
No way.
We sat on the floor, and there were people sat in the seats because it was a hugely popular film.
But still, they oversold on purpose.
I don't know. This was not a megaplex. It was just like a cinema in the north of Seoul, and people were eating squid, and it smelled. And I looked around, and then I saw this film play out with a sort of homosexual relationship. And I looked around, and I thought, David, where are you? What is going on in your life right now? Go back to England. And so that film has stuck with me. And so but I think moving through this, it also shows how Korea itself is changing. Both from the men to the women, and now the queers are here. Tell us about how this works, Nilesh.
How this works is quite a big open question, but
sexuality and homosexuality, and however the correct terminology is to say that this is coming into not only Korean cinema, Korean society, and how these two overlap. I think we've done that thus far.
Yeah, so a couple of years ago, I wrote an article and titled it "The Queers Are Here," because when I ran or co-ran Steak Film and Steak Cinema, we had an event that we called "The Queers Are Here," which was about queer artists. Two we chose from Korea, one from Taiwan. And so when I was writing the piece about queer screen culture, queer cinema in Korea, I thought, oh, this would be a good title. The Queers Are Here.
It's good. It rhymes.
Yeah. Yeah, because there's this invisibility factor, but actually the queers are here and have been here the whole time, in Korea, even if they're not so visible. And I was also fortunate to interview Seo Dong-jin, who was one of the most prominent queer activists in the mid-90s, from around 94 onwards. And I really admired him, and I was so fortunate to meet him in person and interview him. Now, Seo Dong-jin, won't go into too much depth, not into off topic too much, but Seo Dong-jin is so important because he came out as a gay person nationally, as a Korean gay individual on TV. And he started Korea's first LGBTQI, or back then LGBTQ university club, which was at Yonsei University. I think it was called Coming Together. After that, other universities like SNU and Seoul, they started creating their own clubs as well. So anyway, I was fortunate to interview him for the article, and he had written a paper about queer culture in Korea prior to that, back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and something he had said was this. He had said, when one is coerced into remaining a non-social entity, how does one affect changes? You know? And I thought this is actually, it really sums up a lot in that way regarding not just back in the early 2000s, but even now in terms of queer life now.
Mm.
You know, kind of almost the non-existence of queer people here in a systematic way.
The blindness.
The blindness, yeah, you know. Um and so the first thing that comes to mind is the anti-discrimination law. You know, there are in OECD countries, there are two countries that don't have a full anti-discrimination law. One is South Korea, and the other one is Japan. So the anti-discrimination law, for those who are not familiar with it, is a law to protect minorities from discrimination. This includes sexual minorities, women, racial minorities such as ourselves, disabled people, etc. You know, so this is a law to protect people in the workplace, in schools, in society. And so since the early 2000s, there have been queer activists, lawmakers that have tried to enforce this. Still now, we don't have it. It still has not been successful. And it's a governmental decision not to implement this anti-discrimination law. If we have this law, it would allow anyone who's homosexual and feels discriminated against, you know, to have something done about it, right? So the reason I said it's a systematic thing is it's a very governmental. So this silencing of LGBTQI people in Korea, the first aspect is the fact that the government has chosen repeatedly for 20 years at least to implement no anti-discrimination law. That's the first aspect. If we look at recent things, just in the last 2 or 3 years, in the last couple of years, Yoon Suk-yeol brought on a new chairman for the Human Rights Commission of Korea. So the current Human Rights Commission of Korea we have, you know, his job is to protect human rights as a chairman. His name is An Chang-ho. So even though he's the human rights chairman, he's homophobic, you know. And so he has said things in public and to reporters that if we implement the anti-discrimination law, you know, this could increase homosexuality in South Korea. And secondly, he's a Christian, so this is one of the reasons. Not that all Christians are homophobic, but some extreme ones can be, and he's one of them. And secondly, homosexuals, a lot of homosexuals can be tied to Marxism, and the main enemy of Marxism, he says, is Christianity. So there could be some homosexual communists that try to revolt and try to create a communist revolution in South Korea. Right.
Make
so
that film.
yeah, it would be a fun film, I think. You know? So this is, you know, these are very recent words from the Human Rights Commissioner.
For context there, you might push back on this, Nilesh, but
Sure.
the Democratic Party, of which their leaders are often called progressive and human rights lawyers, President Moon Jae-in said he was opposed to it when he was in charge, and the Democratic Party have had a National Assembly majority to push through any laws that they want, unperturbed. You know, they've had this super majority, and they've still not chosen to do it during their time in power.
Exactly.
So it sort of goes across that there is the Justice Party and other parties that do push for it, but across the two main political parties, they seem to, if not share the same intensity of their pushback, it's prevalent in both parties, at least to my mind.
Yeah, I think one of the factors is, you know, the president can only serve one term, right? Which is 5 years. And so because of this kind of frequent change, it's not always easy to try to continue something you've started when there's a new government. And the second aspect is there's a strong, even though the kind of extreme homophobic Christians, we may say they could be the minority, but they're very strong in their voices, in the way they protest, in the numbers they protest outside City Hall. Yeah, you know,
money they have,
influence they have to politicians as well, you know. So these extreme homophobic Christians are very powerful and in their influence on government here. And that has been a big factor why we haven't had an Anti-Discrimination Act, which, continues to silence LGBTQI people here. So, I've mentioned An Chang-ho, the current human rights commissioner who is homophobic. You mentioned Moon Jae-in. And, in 2017, before he became the president, during the presidential election kind of talk show, he was asked about his views on homosexuality, Moon Jae-in was, and he said he was against homosexuality, but he also opposes discrimination against sexual minorities. So, it's kind of like a minus and a plus there.
Better than An Chang-ho, let's say.
Yeah, better than An Chang-ho. But the fact that, a potential president who then became a president verbally says to the masses on TV, I oppose homosexuality, that says a lot.
We're not in London anymore.
It says a lot, to show, we don't care about you, queer guys. It's not a matter of concern.
And this is somebody that would be labelled progressive or human rights or liberal rather because you would expect it from a conservative party.
But this is a liberal. And Moon Jae-in, who was a president from 2017, before he became, he was a human rights lawyer, actually.
That's right.
So for a ex-human rights lawyer to say, I am against human sexuality to the millions.
He did some good things, and it's a very ambiguous topic. I was just trying to point out that it does go across both political sides, even though one side pushes it hard.
It goes across both. Yeah, liberal, left and right, basically, in the silencing of voices, right? And there have been a lot of other hate speeches directly from other politicians against trans people, against homosexuals, very openly, publicly as well. So, we have this systematic government silencing on one hand. And on the topic of government, we've also had Oh Se-hun, the Seoul mayor, who has asked, what is your take on the issue of homosexuality? He has just said, I oppose it, And then later, even Moon Jae-in was asked later while he was a president, and he said, I oppose discrimination in principle, but we have yet to reach a social consensus to legalize same-sex marriage, But then my question at the time was like, when and how can this social consensus be reached on, should queer people be granted human rights, So anyway, there's a lot of controversy coming from the government, which silences queer people, unfortunately, even now.
Let me give you one idea on this, Nilesh,
sure.
which is that sometimes South Korea, people will often say 시기상조, which means it's too early. Not everybody agrees on this yet. It's premature. And I think if you were to do a referendum on, say, the issue of gay marriage in South Korea today across all 50 million people, it probably wouldn't pass. Yeah, it would be closer than it was 20 years ago. But you might be looking at 60-40, 70-30 opposed to it.
Right.
And so if you put through something that the majority of people oppose, it can create tension. And
Absolutely.
so there is some sense that if you push forward with something that the majority of people oppose, you might lose at the polls. You might lose elections and people will go the other way. Whereas Korea seems to be going with the majority, the consensus, rather than the rule of law.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's one I agree with, but...
No, but I mean, politically, as a politician, you have to play the game. And you have to get voters on your side. And, back in 2017, when Moon Jae-in said, I'm against homosexuality, but I'm opposed to discrimination against sexual minorities, and I think he was trying to play the game. If he had said, I embrace homosexuality, he would have lost a lot of potential voters.
He's a Catholic himself.
On both sides, he would have lost a lot from older people, from the church majority as well. So, I understand, as a politician, as the government, they also have to try to please the majority.
The pop stars and the celebrities don't speak out about it much in Korea either, do they?
Right.
They're very silent on the topic.
Yeah, exactly.
There's not much allyship or support. There is some very ambiguous things and rainbow flags in social media posts, but anybody just coming out in an interview saying very bluntly or very clearly, unambiguously, you shouldn't be opposed or for gay people. They're people. They should be seen, recognized, protected like anything else. That's kind of missing a bit.
It is missing for sure. Coming from voices that we respect, right? And earlier you mentioned how just today in the news.
Yeong-ja.
Yoon came out about her son, right,
Mm.
being in a same-sex relationship as well, which is great. And hopefully we have more of this, in the near future as well.
Does this come into cinema?
Yes, it does. Yeah, so I think related to cinema, I'm interested, and right now I'm writing a paper about, when as Sir Dong-jin had said, when voices remain a silent entity, how can they affect changes? Of course, from since the mid-90s at least, there have been LGBTQI activists, who are a small number compared to the majority of LGBTQI people, but they're active and they try to create changes, which is great. But the question in my paper that I'm in the process of researching is, if there's a systematic discrimination from especially the government against LGBTQI people, how can cinema be against this? How can it show another side to the existence of LGBTQI people? So certain lawmakers, certain systems hide it. As a quick example, you mentioned celebrities, but there was a case I think during COVID where IKEA, they have this big, their famous big bags, right? They have this big rainbow-colored flag, and so back in European countries, a part of the percentage of the sales of this rainbow-colored bag goes to LGBTQI organizations, charities, and they advertise it as that. If you buy this bag, maybe 10% of the proceeds will go to this charity, But then they decided to sell the same bag in Korea, in the Korean market, and they totally dropped any wording related to LGBTQI, which makes sense from a business perspective. I mean, if you don't mention LGBTQI, more people will just buy the bag because it's cute.
Yeah.
It's a rainbow color. It's nice. It's useful.
Yeah.
We don't have to go political.
A lot of Korean people aren't aware of the association of the rainbow.
Exactly, especially middle-aged to older people, I would say, as well. So there was controversy during COVID about this. About promoting it in Europe, but then not here. There have also been similar things about car companies like Hyundai. For example, they openly support LGBTQI organizations in Western countries, but then they never mention anything about that in Korea. For example, during Pride Week, around June in Korea, we have the Pride Festival and stalls and things, but they're never there, for example. So we talked about the government, but then there are also these other factors like big conglomerates and companies that are also part of this silencing, right? Or queer people don't exist, we can just use the cute flag. On the back.
They're queer baiting to an extent, or just trying to profit and localize their values for different markets. Maybe is a better way of expressing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right. So there's a film that comes to mind. If we relate it to cinema, there's a film that was made in 2019, I think by Im Dae-young. It's called Moonlit Winter. Have you seen that or heard of it?
No.
It wasn't a big hit. It's an independent film, very well made. And just, I would say, very localized to the Korean or Asian context more than the Western context. And let's see, to put it brief, it's about a middle-aged woman. Maybe she's in her 50s. She's divorced. Her daughter lives with her. Her daughter's like a high school student, will become a university student soon. They live together. She has kind of a working class job, and she doesn't. The mother doesn't look that happy. She's just in and out of life, going through the routines. And then one day, a letter arrives in the post to their apartment, and it's from Japan. And the daughter, she's very inquisitive, so she opens the letter before her mother does, even though it's addressed to the mother. She secretly opens the letter, and she reads it, and she finds out it's from a woman who lives in Japan. And she's writing about the Japanese woman who's actually Japanese Korean, half Japanese, half Korean, but lives in Japan. She's writing about all the good times she had with the mother, more than a couple of decades ago, and how she misses her, etc., etc. So there's this clear lesbian tone in the letter
Mm.
that the daughter reads and then seals it up again and puts it back like she hasn't touched it, you know. And so I won't go into too much of the details, not too many spoiler alerts, but the daughter ends up organizing a trip, like just a small family trip for the two of them to the area of Japan, and secretly arranges, you know, a meeting of the two ex-lovers. Now, the reason I mention this film, Moonlit Winter, which everyone should watch, is because it has a lot of empathy. First of all, the Korean mother, is reunited with her ex-lesbian lover after like 20 years or so. You know, so there's this empathy that is created in the fact that they're reunited, and the fact that they could never have been a couple. You know, we learn in the film that this Korean mother had been in a relationship with this Korean Japanese woman, I think in high school. She came out to her parents when she was in high school. Her parents thought she was crazy, and they sent her to, what do you call those centers? Like they tried to
Re-education, rehabilitation.
Yeah,
Probably getting my words wrong.
Yeah, some kind of rehabilitation to get the homosexuality out of you. So they,
Exorcism.
yeah, that kind of
in the day. Yes.
Yeah, so you know the Korean mother had been sent to this rehabilitation camp center thing, and even though her brother knew she didn't like men, her brother recommended her to marry his friend. So she ended up marrying the friend, this male Korean man. And then from the male Korean man, you know, the daughter was born. At some point, she decided to divorce that man, you know. So we learn all these truths through the film. The fact that seemingly she's very heterosexual. You know, she got married to a man. She had a kid. She has a normal job. You know, she's trying to raise her daughter as best as she can, get her to university. She's very normal, you know. And then later we learn, oh, actually, she's a lesbian, or at least she's bisexual. And the fact that she had this huge heartbreak of having to depart from her real lover, you know, the woman, the Japanese Korean woman, and she had gone through so much hardship and pain of her family not accepting her homosexuality, etc., etc. You know, so the reason I strongly recommend this film, Moonlit Winter, is because the film depicts a very seemingly normal heterosexual woman, and then later we learn more depth. Oh, actually, she's a human and she has feelings, and she has suffered a lot because of everything she has sacrificed to please her parents, to please her brother, to please society. You know, and the secret that has kept that has been hidden in her heart for so long, right? That has probably eaten up at her. So I think this creates a lot of empathy and understanding to those who may be heterosexual, to those who may have concerns about homosexuality, you know. So I think this film is very, very successful about this topic. And secondly, the daughter, you know, she's very young. She's like end of high school, beginning of university. And she doesn't openly talk about homosexuality, but through her actions, we can see her that she's actively supporting her mother in trying to obtain happiness as well, you know? Yeah, and I think often if we think about how homosexuality is reflected in society and in film, in Korean or Asian cinema versus the West, there's quite a big difference. You know, we're both from the UK, and in the UK or Western countries, coming out is a big thing, right? For those who are, you know, in the closet, there's often a negative. There are negative things associated with that. Oh, you know, he or she or they are living in shame. They don't have the guts, the courage, the confidence to come out. But then once they've come out, they can embrace their homosexuality, etc. You know, so coming out is seen usually in Western countries, as a very positive thing.
Certainly now, from maybe the 90s, early 2000 onwards.
Not
always.
Right. No, not always.
Or 70s.
Yeah, but more from the 90s onwards, I'd say, you know. Whereas, in the Korean or Asian context, it's not the same case, actually. I mean, coming out can be good, of course, and we've had many examples of that. Not quite enough, but some. But often there's a lot of shame related. Confucianism is still very strong here. There's a strong expectation from your parents and family to have a heterosexual marriage, to ideally have children and continue the family name and lineage as well. So these expectations are still very strong, right? Um, and so for this film, for Moonlit Winter, to reflect a non-Western stance, the fact that this middle-aged Korean woman has not come out. She hasn't said to her daughter even that I'm a lesbian or I'm bisexual. She hasn't come out. But through the actions of her daughter and choices she has decided to make, she has come out to herself, which has led to some more happiness and contentness in her heart.
That's nice.
And to add to this factor of this inner coming out from this character, the job that she has in Moonlit Winter is because her brother helped her get that job. And she ends up quitting that job. She lives in the same hometown that her brother lives in. And it's because of her brother that she married the man that she ended up divorcing. She ends up leaving the hometown with her daughter to create a new life somewhere else. So in this film, we see this accumulation of good things happening. First, her daughter is invisibly supporting her, arranges this trip. Her daughter secretly reunites her mother with the ex-female lover. The mother just tries to let go of this patriarchal control that she's had in her life up to now, from the parents, but also from the brother. Literally leaving the hometown to start a new life with her daughter. And another factor that comes to mind is this mother. She mentions how she was never able to get a university education because her parents only had enough money to send one child to university, so they chose her brother to go to university. So it's this, kind of resentment and anger, this frustration that has been in her heart because she wanted a university education, but she was never able to and allowed to, as a woman, put second after the man, after the brother, right? So by moving, first she tries to cut this patriarchal tie to her brother by leaving the hometown. And then she's moving away with her daughter to support her daughter to get to university. So, she couldn't personally continue this higher education herself, but she's supporting her daughter as much as she can to not suffer.
It's nice.
Yeah, so this film, Moonlit Winter, it just has so many things in there, which is about kind of de-silencing oneself. And in a very, I'd say, a Korean or Asian way, which is far more, I'd say, applicable and digestible and understandable, relatable to more local LGBTQI audiences and heterosexual audiences as well, I think.
With the influences here of Confucianism, of filial piety, of a focus on harmony, patriarchy, because sometimes people don't come out because they want not to carry on the lineage, but not to disrupt the family, to make things calm. They don't want to stay game. Yeah. And shame is a big thing. When we spoke about comedy being used as a tool to lower people's psychological defenses, and then you hit them with the realities or things like this. It seems what you're describing in Moonlit Winter is similar. You present somebody through which you can develop empathy or see yourself and understand, and relate slowly and relate to. Excellent. And then slowly you show them, yes, this person is a human. This person does bleed and feel and love and dream and regret. And then they are this. It was similar in the drama Mine, I believe. There was a Korean drama called Mine that was on Netflix about these high, very rich, affluent families. And the main character, the woman, after a while, you realize that her long lost lover was a woman. And this was slowly revealed and you'd already got to like this woman. You know, it didn't come out like that at the start, but you build up a rapport and a relationship with this woman. She's married in the beginning to a man, and you realize her long lost love is a woman. And then you see her more compassionately, but also more three-dimensional.
Yeah. So these are good strategies, right? You know, whether it's through comedy and lightness and or relatability through the kind of seemingly heterosexual world.
And then I
as well.
wanted to point you to ask you about Agashi or the Handmaiden, because we've spoken about Park Chan-wook. That's where we started. We've spoken about Kim Min-hee. We've spoken about Korea and Japan. The Handmaiden was maybe 2016, which is, you know, a long time in South Korean cultural changes. And this is one of the more explicit movies I've ever seen. The Handmaiden doesn't just feature a lesbian kiss.
I know it's more than that.
It's incredible for those that haven't seen it. This is one of the country's biggest directors in 2016, getting Kim Tae-ri and Kim Min-hee to do things that you would normally only expect to find on Pornhub or other sites, but doing it beautifully lit on the big screens.
Right? Very cinematic. Yes.
Any thoughts on how this ties in? Is it included in this section?
I think we have to kind of also understand the historical background of lesbianism, I'd say, compared to gay men in Korean history, in popular culture. Because traditionally, like, if we go back to, for example, there's a professor and writer who I like called Todd Henry. He's a professor, I think, including of Korean studies back in the USA. And he published a book during COVID called Queer Korea, initially published in English and then in Korean. And the book has many good essays in there from various academics, you know. And it makes me think of one of the essays, and it talks about, if I remember correctly, it talks about stories that were written in the 60s and 70s in kind of like small books, like easy to read, easy to digest books. And often, not often, but sometimes these stories were about lesbian characters, you know, written by men. Yeah. And then if we think about cinema, there have been certain lesbian stories in film, also in the 90s and early 2000s as well. And basically the academic that had written this paper was saying how traditionally in South Korea, it's been far more open and acceptable to depict lesbian relationships in literature and in film rather than gay men, you know, in relationships. First of all, usually the writers have been male, so there could be this attachment of male fantasy of lesbian lovers and lesbian sex, and rather than portraying, you know, gay people in a relationship or having sex. And secondly, these have been seen as fads as well. So something that a young girl is going through a phase. You know, because traditionally in Korea, schools were separated, right? So universities, you know, girls went to girls' schools, boys went to boys' schools. And so traditionally, you would end up spending more time with your same-sex friends, right? And so there could be a chance that you may end up being a bit physical, you know, with the same-sex friend, right? And so this has been depicted in literature and also film as well. But it's just seen as a phase, you know, as a special friendship.
Puberty exploration.
Exactly, puberty exploration. But then, you know, it's fine. This boy will grow out of it, and they'll do the right thing and marry the opposite sex and have children as well, you know. So I think we have to understand this film also from the context of what had come historically before in Korea, and the easier acceptance of lesbianism and the depiction of it based on Korean writers and the history of that as well in literature and in film as well, you know, rather than gay men.
Sure.
Yeah. Right.
There is research that I've seen that shows society is most likely to, because we talk about LGBT or LGBTQI plus as a monolith concept, but society is more readily accepting of bisexual women and then gay women and then gay men and then bisexual men as the least accepting. So we might very easily see Madonna and Britney Spears or something, or a kiss on a Super Bowl or whatever it might be. And that's more acceptable to us than other depictions of it. And so it's really interesting to see. And it was interesting to see for me how bisexual men was the least accepted, at least in this research. Certainly in Korea, with the element of Confucianism, if a man was to be homosexual, was seen by some in Korea as anti-patriotic, because you were meant to serve the nation by going to the army, by having children and serving the nation. And so it wasn't just about associations with Marxism and communism and homosexuality, but it was also anti-patriotic, unpatriotic, I should say, to do that.
Right, that makes sense.
Big context.
Yeah, the unpatriotic part, especially the fact that military service, has been such a big component of South Korean culture.
And homosexuality is illegal in the military, I believe, even between two consenting males.
Yeah, it's been in the news a lot. I remember during COVID and even after that, there have been cases of men, like at least 2 men having sex off base in their own apartments, but that also being illegal as well. And the human rights organization have been trying to deal with that aspect as well. So there's also something related to, obviously military is a big part of it, and patriarchy is another
Cold
aspect.
War and all of this is bigger. It's not just Korea, is it? This is a bigger systemic push on individuality, sexuality.
Absolutely. And the idea of patriarchy as well, we briefly mentioned about women being the one that have suffered in Korean cinema. They either get killed or wiped out, or they suffer in some way, right? But if we think about patriarchy and homosexuality, and think about gay sex, not always, but often one man is being penetrated. So then this is also the opposite of an ideal patriarchal situation. In a patriarchal situation, it is the women who should be penetrated, who should be, taken in that way, right? Not the man as well. So, yeah, the whole gay thing can be quite layered there in comparison to lesbianism, I'd say.
Girl love dramas and boy love dramas are becoming very popular amongst my students. They're telling me all about these GL and BL dramas that are now appearing on Netflix and other streaming sites. So while they're not always explicit or in that sort of Handmaiden thing, it's becoming more sort of common, I think, amongst young people.
Especially women.
Especially straight women as well. Like watching it.
They're the biggest audience, actually. Young straight women are the biggest audience for these boy love, boy love cartoons.
Yes, exactly.
Literature.
Were you aware of how the naming concept works in shipping, Nilesh? So because you've just mentioned the idea of a person being penetrated, I was doing my own research into things. And if you have Jimin and Jungkook from BTS, and they're shipped together, so you create a fantasy relationship between these two, and then you would name them Jiguk. This means that Jimin is the top and Jungkook is the bottom. So the name that comes first is the top, and they will be depicted on the left in all the art and things, and the name that comes on the right is the bottom.
Interesting.
But this is how it works. And when I was telling my students about this, I'm like, Professor, how do you know this? It was like I'd seen into this world of which young people had created.
Yeah. This is not an element that I'm very familiar with, and you probably have far more knowledge about, about this area, right? But I mean, on research that I have done, the fact that these younger Korean women and straight women who are drawn to these boy love stories, there's something safe there. These men or these young men, like BTS characters.
Soft masculinity.
Yeah, soft masculinity. Well. They're slim, they have beautiful skin, they're soft in their character. There's something, that that alludes to trust. Right, as well. Non-violence as well.
There's no threat. There's beauty, but there's no horniness or lust. Something like that.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a safe space for younger straight women to explore this element.
Here's one more idea, because these people are often young women, not exclusively, but they don't have much socio-political power, socio-economic power. So how can they take control? How can the the quote that you wanted to start with from So Dong-jin, when one is coerced into remaining a non-social entity, how does one affect changes? For young women, they can actually motivate and manipulate the pop culture world through their actions, because when entertainment companies hear about the most popular shipping couples, they will then make this couple in real life stand next to each other on stage and do fan service for it. So the entertainment companies respond to these desires. So it's like they've got a metaverse, but they're actually playing with real people.
Very powerful.
And because of capitalism, people respond. I just want to say one thing about how does one affect changes, because I have Todd Henry's Queer Career, that collection of essays, and I've read through it, and I respect his work immensely because he does brilliant stuff. But I find a lot of the language, Nilesh, hard to understand. I'm not dumb, but when I read some of the essays on Queer Career and surrounding things, it's very difficult for me to parse.
Right.
So my question for you is that a way of affecting change by sort of resisting standardized language, or is that just me not being familiar enough with it? Or
it depends on what kind of language you're talking about, because queer people, like in many countries, but focusing on Korea, have had their own language to tell each other apart from the masses, from the heterosexual masses, and that's a common part in the book, in that Queer Korea book as well, and language that has been used as well, So, for example, there's one writer in Queer Korea that talks about the word pogal, and how back in, I mean, just to put it briefly, these words we use now in Korea, including words that Koreans use like gay, lesbian, trans, these are Western imported words that mostly came through the West into Korea in the 90s, especially the mid-90s onwards, and people still use, even when speaking in Korean. But before that, this writer had talked about the 80s, and there was a word that gay Korean men use called pogal, which is a twist on kalbo. And kalbo actually means prostitute. So they turned that word, they reversed it and called themselves pogal. Kind of saying, oh, we're kind of prostitutes. Because, in the 80s, I mean, even now so much in some way, but it was even more conservative, and gay lifestyles were even far less accessible than they are now for gay men in Korea. And, sexual hookups were just easier to do than having a relationship with a man with the same sex, right? Or living together with someone, So that's kind of some of the language that they talk about in Queer Korea, especially one of the writers in one of the essays. Yeah, so it makes me think of that. Yeah, but I just I had a thought about what you mentioned about the influence of these what do you call them,
BL dramas?
Yeah, BL dramas, and the influence that the online fandom has offline as well.
And as a way of reclaiming power.
As a way of reclaiming power, yeah.
Affecting change.
And affecting change, yeah. And it makes me think of a paper that I had written a couple of years ago. Now, prior to the paper, I had been doing some research on a Spanish philosopher who I really admire. His name is Paul Preciado. Now, Paul Preciado was initially Beatriz Preciado, so was born a woman, but then, through hormone therapy, etc., became a man, and then called herself Paul. So she's a philosopher, very well known in this field, and I read quite a few books by Paul Preciado, and one of the books is about the anus and penetration, and penetration has been a big factor everywhere in the world for men to dominate women. Men have a penis, they either rape or sexually dominate women, right? And it could be historically in South Korea, Japanese women on Korean women through the comfort women. It could be the American GIs with Korean women or Korean prostitutes, right? Korea has its own relationship with colonization and men and this aspect of penetration, right? And we've talked about women having the short end of the stick in films often, historically in Korean cinema. Now, Paul Preciado talks about penetration. And what if penetration was reversed? So instead of the stereotypical men penetrating women and asserting this sexual power, which can equal political power, supremacy over a woman, not just on the micro individual level, but macro on the nation level. What if this is reversed? Paul Prashado questions this in one of his books. And so I wrote a paper on this and then presented it to the East Asia Institute a couple of years ago. And my paper was taking his concept, which is called anal castration. And I put that concept of anal castration onto the Korean context. So first of all, to put it briefly, anal castration by Paul Prashado is this concept, this idea that heterosexual men have castrated their anus, metaphorically speaking. So no one can penetrate them. They can't be penetrated. Therefore, they retain power. They retain masculinity, maintain patriarchy. But what if this ceases to be? And so in my paper, I questioned, because in the paper I wrote, there's a lot of facts I found about how Korean women have the short end of the stick, living in this, improving but patriarchal society, And in my paper I write, what if penetration was reversed? Korean women penetrating their male partners through other ways, through the finger or through sex toys. And if this is done in a in a sexual relationship, Korean woman to Korean man, either as sex partners, as boyfriends, husband or wife, the question is, could this lead to a change, in perceptions and behaviors as well? So, can I make a comment about on the topic of sex? You had mentioned about the top and the bottom part, right, regarding gay men earlier.
The name on the left is the top.
Yeah, the name on the left is the top. The name on the right is the bottom. Yes. Yeah. So we also need to be aware that in gay relationships, some people are 100% top, some people are 100% bottoms, but they're also versatiles. And versatile gay men are ones that can penetrate, but can also be penetrated. So if we think about the versatility that some gay men can have in their sexual relationships with other men, we can also think about this versatility that heterosexual Korean women can potentially have with their male partner as well, of not just the Korean woman being penetrated, but also the Korean woman penetrating their Korean partner as well, So, and would this versatility create some kind of change in their own romantic relationship? Would this affect things socially or not? That's a question, really.
I think I've observed, Nilesh, that the world is becoming more feminine in terms that when I grew up, men didn't cry. We weren't meant to talk about mental health. And I'm not saying that this change is good or bad, but it's just an observation. I think with changing economic power and responses and reactions to things which have come before, but we are now all meant to be more attuned to empathy and mental health and feelings much more than in the past. And so I think the world has become more feminine. What that entirely means, I'm not sure, but there does seem to have been that shift, even in terms of comedy. When we spoke about the early 2000s comedy of My Sassy Girl, comedy used to be quite brutal when I was growing up. And a lot of the things that I grew up comfortably watching and saying have now sort of been redacted on streaming platforms, or
classified as racist,
or they come with warnings. Yes, and at the time we didn't necessarily, we might have thought some of it was edgy. We might not have thought anything of some of them, but certainly there have been changes, and so how that plays out, I'm not sure. Before we go towards,
can I just add something to what you said?
Go on. Yeah,
regarding the world potentially maybe is becoming more feminine, is what you said. If we apply that to, and you mentioned mental health, right? And also, if you think about recent days, like now, the last 2 years since or so that Yoon Suk-yeol has been the president, because of, not that I'm praising him, but because of Yoon Suk-yeol and the government that we just had until recently, mental health has become a more important aspect that has been talked about in politics. And the Yoon Suk-yeol government has been trying to implement more mental health support, as depression and suicide are such a big problem in this country. So that kind of, just wanted to add that kind of element of mental health improvement and certain feminine or empathy kind of improving here in this country as well.
Especially for men, actually, because when South Korea has the largest suicide rates, unquestionably, or the data, I'm not sure how to say this, but the by far the biggest driver of this world's highest suicide rate is old men. There is often a focus on young people and women and minorities, and rightly so, because but when you look at the amount of men that carry it out, these are normally elderly men that have grown up in a system that has treated them in certain ways, and now we have this world of kiosks and untaxed society, and it's very different from what they've grown up in, and so I think that's helpful. I think it's important to acknowledge the changes that have taken place, and not always see people as good and bad. You remember when we was talking about Chilsu and Mansu and these kind of things, and people are a product of their system. People are angry because of this. People are jealous because of what happened. People are this because of their mother. We're all a product of something somewhere.
Which is the benefit of watching film, you know, in any nation really. But since we're on the topic of Korea and South Korea, the benefit of watching, if we watch, you know, I strongly encourage people, if they're interested in Korean or South Korean culture, I strongly encourage people, and most people like watching films, right, for entertainment, you know. And I strongly recommend people to watch films, especially slightly older films. You know, they might be from the early 2000s, the 90s or the 80s or the 70s, maybe 60s. But it's just that, you know, we know things, generally we know things about the past, right? We know generally maybe about a bit about the Park Chung-hee era or about the Chunduban authoritarian era in the 80s, you know. When we watch films like that, because there's such a distance in years and time that has passed, it's easier for us to connect the dots. Oh, you know, Chilsu and Mansu depicts this because of the authoritarian government of the time, because of westernization, capitalism increasing in Korea, etc., etc. We can connect the dots more easily. And then once an individual or people have done that, of evaluating and watching older films and connecting the dots either themselves or in conversation with friends, then I recommend people to come to the present time. What are we witnessing in South Korea's present cinema? What is the present cinema depicting? How is it depicting men or women or homosexuality, etc., minorities? And what does it say or potentially say about the current socio-political cultural situation of this country, right?
Lovely.
Yeah, so...
Because culture is what other people do, and we analyse that, and we look at things from the 70s and the 80s, and we say,
it's fun to do.
Look at the but we don't think we're doing it right now, but we are. We're living and doing and performing something that people in the future will look back and say, wow, look what they did in 2025, look what they were wearing, saying, representing, and we're sort of doing it unconsciously or unthinkingly, perhaps.
Exactly, because we're these small people in the system now, right? We're not like on top of that skyscraper on the bounty looking down.
It's interesting that they were always up high but voiceless, rather, because you would imagine they would be in the tier like Parasite. I've been thinking about this the whole time. They were unheard. They had a voice, but they were unheard or misunderstood, but they were high. They were high, not like they were smoking wacky, but they were physically high. They were up, and we normally associate elevated positions with positions of power and status.
Right, good point.
I'm not sure why they're up high. Nilesh, this has been wonderful, and I'm going to bring you back to talk about zombies, because we haven't even got anywhere near zombies yet, and I would love to. Before we go to some recommendations, is there anything that we've missed about cinema, or something that you want to touch on?
Just a final couple of things. You know, I mean, I just mentioned about, you know, the joy of analysing older films in connection to their social, historical, cultural context. And then the joy of like doing that now on contemporary cinema, right? Or trying to do that ourselves or with friends. And it kind of makes me think of queer cinema now. And where are we now? You know, and I had mentioned Moonlit Winter from 2019 earlier. And it brings me to like current cultural things related to LGBTQI in Korea. One is like, you know, because initially I mentioned the systematic silencing, right, from the government, from large corporations, and how is cinema and how are people going against that, you know. One factor that happened back in 2014 is Dave Kim Sung-wan, his Korean name, and Kim Jo Kwang-soo, his male partner, a film director and film producer, who got married on Cheonggyecheon. That was a very big political statement. That was back in 2014, so it's a while ago. But more recently, just in the last 2 years, a lesbian couple who got legally married abroad, they had the first baby in Korea, the first baby to be born from a lesbian couple.
Yeah.
So that's a big thing,
Yeah.
right? And there are big changes. Like I learned from Pew Research that people over the age of 50 in Korea, only 23% of those over 50 believe that homosexuality should be accepted. Whereas when Pew researched people between 18 and 29, Koreans between 18 and 29, 79% believe in the acceptance of homosexuality. So that's a big change now,
Yeah.
between the older generation and the younger ones, right? So leading back to film, what is happening now in film and screen culture on this topic of LGBTQI cinema in South Korea? So one is Netflix launched Love in the Big City. There's a drama series. It's about a gay man. There's the drama series of Love in the Big City, and there's the film version.
There's the book as well.
And there's the book, which I read when
Yeah.
it came out. Yeah. So these are big things, and the fact that it's on Netflix is a big thing. Secondly, Wave. Is it Wave or Wave? The streaming site in Korea. So in 2022, they launched 2 queer dating, what do you call them? Dating
Shows?
shows,
Programs?
programs. One was called Merry Queer,
Mm-hmm.
which is about queer people dating or trying to find a date.
Yeah.
The second one in 2020 was called His Man, about gay men trying to find a gay date. So this is very progressive,
Yeah.
And now this, today's the 20th of April, so on the 25th of April, in 5 days, Wave is launching a lesbian dating show in 5 days called To Get Her.
Like Together.
Yeah, like Together, but To Get Her. Yeah, that's right.
It's quite good.
Yeah. So this is
Does it work in Korean? To Get Her. It's very good in
in
English.
English,
I mean,
yeah,
the
because it's
title.
written as like To Get Her, but also put together. So
Yeah.
you can read it as Together or To Get Her.
Yeah.
So this is great. This is very progressive for screen culture in Korea. So these are some recommendations and some highlights we have of the evolution of LGBTQI in society, but also in screen and cinema culture.
Yeah.
Moving away from the initial quote I mentioned about the silencing of queer bodies in this country, right?
And there's Kim Dol-dol, and there's also Pungja, who's become very popular. So I think more and more people, even if they watch mainstream television and they don't go on to Wave or they don't see these new dating shows, I think most Korean people know about Pungja. And their representation is increasing. It's not just one or two things like this, and that's just so important. I think it's. I've always believed growing up that I had gay friends around me at school and things like that. And when you're on the same football team as a gay person or they're in your class, and that's when you realize that it's not about liking them or hating them or having, because you don't necessarily like or hate mountains or the wind or sun. It's just there. It's just there. It's just nature. And I think it's the same with people like this personally.
Exactly.
It's not taking a moral stance against the wind or something.
Exactly.
It's just a fact.
There. Yeah, it's a fact. And earlier you had mentioned about the legalization of gay marriage, and if the majority of the citizens are against it, then it's not good for the government, etc. But so there are these factors. There are governmental legal factors which prevent things moving forward as quickly as we may want them to. But personally, I believe that screen culture, cinema, film, dramas, dating shows, these are the ways that can start to direct the majority to creating more understanding, empathy, warmth, towards LGBTQI in Korea as well. I think screen culture, cinema has a big duty and a big influence on the masses in that way. And Moonlit Winter is an example of that as well.
It's on my list. Very well said. Give us some recommendations, Nilesh.
So Moonlit Winter for sure. And then I also recommend the book that probably a lot of people have heard of, Kim Ji-young, born in 1982.
Parish Opinion thing.
Yeah, I think it came out in 2016, the Korean version, and then since then it's been translated into English and many other languages. I watched the film version too, but more than the film, I strongly recommend reading the book. And I know it's controversial, and feminism is controversial in South Korea. It's just, when I read it, for me, it just gave a very good insight of things that I will never experience. First of all, I'm a man. Secondly, I'm not Korean. This is specifically what some or many Korean women go through. Sexism at work, or feeling unsafe walking home in the evening, right? Or being criticized for being a mother without a job, So these are things that open our eyes, especially if we're not a woman, especially if we're not a Korean woman. And for me, reading Kim Ji-young was a very big eye-opener. And I think the timing of that with the whole Me Too movement in South Korea.
Gangnam Toilet Murder was...
The Gangnam Toilet Murder.
2016, same time, wasn't it?
And then I think the Me Too movement started in 2018. So, that period of feminism really rising on a big scale, the book is very telling of that period, and even now, I think. And it's also, I think, was it Jenny from Red Velvet? I forget. Anyway, there was a singer from a girl band.
So Irene, I think it might have been
I forget names
from Red Velvet.
Yeah, maybe. Anyway, there was a singer from Red Velvet who was being interviewed around that time, like, oh, what book are you reading? And she said, oh, I'm reading Kim Ji-young, born in 1982. And she got so much flack afterwards, like so bad comments from online fans, especially males, because of that, So anyway, I just think it's a great book. It's very insightful, and it's very telling of the times of where women are, what Korean women have gone through, and a direction that is changing and hopefully will change even quicker.
RM from BTS came out and said that he was reading it. He recommended it as one of his books, and he caught a lot less flack. And so it was very interesting. It was very interesting, the responses that women were sort of looked down upon for reading it. You said that you're not Korean, you're not a woman, but there's also that Palishipinyan saying fact of the title, which is
80s.
The lives of women that grew up in the 80s and lived through the 90s would be very different, I think, from a young woman just coming into her adulthood today in 2025. So it reminds us of what women did experience, and maybe still to a certain extent are experiencing. There's a time to it.
Right. So both these two recommendations, like Moonlit Winter, for that lesbian homosexual perspective, which is very Korean Asian friendly, and secondly Kim Ji-young, born in 1982, the book, the novel, with this Korean feminist perspective.
Perfect, brilliant. Nilesh, this was wonderful. I can't believe all the things. I love talking about Korean cinema, and I love talking about it with you. So thank you very much for coming here, and thank you for sharing everything with me.
Thanks for inviting me. It's been really good fun, really. And time has just gone by so quickly, right?
Yes.
I hope the viewers don't get bored from the amount of time
This is all for me. Don't worry. Thank you very much, sir.
Yes. Thank you, David.
Thank you.